Have you ever stopped to wonder why so many Western movies paint the Middle East as this, mysterious land of deserts and danger? Well, today, we're diving into the book that really gives us the tools to unpack all of that. We're talking about Edward Said's Orientalism, a book that absolutely revolutionized how we think about the relationship between the West and the East.
So it really all boils down to this one big question. How does one culture represent another? I mean, when a really powerful culture, from Europe or America, decides to study and show us what a culture from the Middle East or Asia is like, what's really going on there?
And this is where Said drops his bombshell. Is it just about understanding, or is it actually an act of power? He argues, pretty convincingly, that for centuries, the West's whole project of studying the East wasn't just some innocent academic curiosity. Nope, it was a tool of power, a way to dominate and to control. Okay, so how did this whole system of power actually work? Well, this brings us to Said's first huge point. He says the Orient, this idea of the East, wasn't something that was discovered, it was invented. It was constructed by the West for the West.
And this gets to the core of his definition. Orientalism, he says, is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So we're not just talking about a bunch of biased stories or, silly stereotypes. It's way deeper than that. It's a whole system, a complete framework of thought that basically let the West manage and, in a way, create the Orient politically, sociologically, you name it. At the end of the day, it's a tool of power.
You see, the Orient pretty much became the West's own fantasy playground. It was this imagined, timeless place full of romance, exotic people, and hazy, beautiful memories. But, and this is the key part, it was also seen as conveniently backward and in desperate need of Western help. And the thing is, this powerful story, this fiction, had next to nothing to do with the actual, real lives of the people who lived there.
So, who was the guy who saw all of this so clearly? To really get Orientalism, you've got to understand Edward Said himself. His personal story is absolutely key, because it gave him this unique perspective that almost no one else had.
Okay, so Said was born in Jerusalem in 1935 to a Palestinian Christian family. He even described himself as a minority inside a minority. He grew up in colonial Palestine and Egypt, and then he goes on to build this amazing academic career in America. So you see, he was always, in a way, on the outside looking in.
And that right there is the key to his entire way of thinking. This idea of exile, of being an outsider. For Said, it wasn't just sad or tragic. It was an intellectual tool. It gave him this incredible vantage point, this ability to see the hidden links between culture and power that were totally invisible to people who were comfortably on the inside of the system.
All right, so let's get into the nuts and bolts. How did this system actually work? This is where we get to Said's most mind-blowing insight, the direct link between creating knowledge and using power.
Now, to make this argument, Said drew heavily on the work of the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Foucault had this big idea that knowledge is never neutral, and when you think about it, it makes perfect sense, right? The power to define something is the power to control it, and that is exactly what Said saw happening with this whole concept of the Orient.
And look, it's not like this was some hidden conspiracy. Said actually quotes this British colonial administrator Arthur Balfour, who laid it out plain as day when talking about governing Egypt. Knowledge gives power, more power requires more knowledge, and so on. This was the open, stated logic of empire. If you want to rule over a people, first you have to know them, you have to define them, categorize them, and study them. So you see this self-reinforcing cycle, right? It's like a feedback loop. Step 1, Western scholars and artists create knowledge about the East. Step 2, this knowledge is then used to justify colonial rule, saying things like they're unfit to rule themselves. And then, step 3, to keep control, the empire needs even more detailed knowledge, which just reinforces all the original stereotypes. It's a perfect closed loop.
So what did this knowledge actually look like in practice? Well, Said basically uncovered the Orientalist playbook. He saw this consistent set of themes and stereotypes that were used over and over and over again.
And a huge part of this playbook was based on simple, powerful opposites. Orientalism basically worked by defining the East as everything the West supposedly was not. So if the West, the Occident, was rational, civilized, and masculine, then the East, the Orient, had to be irrational, primitive, and feminine. If the West was normal, the East was abnormal. It created this really stark, simple, and totally false division.
And out of these simple binaries came this whole flood of really dehumanizing stereotypes.
The Oriental was seen as incapable of self-government. The whole region was seen as a dead land, with a rich past but a totally sterile present. People were seen not as a human reality, but as a field of study. They were stereotyped as neurotic, lecherous, passive. Just look at this list. It's all about reducing entire populations down to these negative, simple traits. It turns them into objects to be studied, not complex human beings.
And all of this whole framework, provided the perfect justification for colonialism. It wasn't sold as a violent takeover. Oh no, it was framed as this noble, fatherly mission. The story they told was that the superior West was just stepping in to rescue the decaying East, to restore it to some mythical past greatness that, of course, it couldn't possibly achieve on its own.
Okay, so after completely taking apart this whole system, where does that leave us? Did Said have an alternative? Absolutely. And this is where his work moves beyond just critique and offers us a whole new way of seeing the world. Said's alternative is something he called a contrapuntal perspective. Now that sounds super academic, I know, but the idea is actually beautiful and simple. Think of music. Instead of seeing cultures as separate solo instruments, each playing their own tune, he said we need to listen for the counterpoint, the way they're all involved with one another. He argued that no culture is single or pure. They're all hybrid, mixed up, and wonderfully messy. So the big takeaway is this: we have to embrace complexity. Said argued for a pluralistic vision. He saw cultures for what they really are: hybrid, mixed, and beautifully impure. His whole goal was to get rid of those rigid us versus them categories of Orientalism and replace them with something more fluid, more connected, and at the end of the day, a much more human way of seeing the world. And that really leaves us with a final question to chew on. Said's work isn't just about dusty old books or history. It's about right now. It's a challenge to every one of us to really look at the stories we watch, the news we read, the assumptions we make every single day. It leaves us with this big, ongoing question. In a world of overlapping cultures, where we're more connected than ever, how do we unlearn the myths we've been told?